There are three main problems with most workplace violence prevention plans. Is your company doing the same things? One of the biggest issues that I see right now with workplace violence prevention plans is that a rapidly increasing type of workplace violence is actually not one of the four source types of workplace violence. And by that, I mean grievance-driven violence. Think Brown University and the MIT professor. Think the CEO of United Healthcare. Think the legislators from Minnesota or even Charlie Kirk. These are grievance-driven incidents of workplace violence. They are not typical and not like the four source types of workplace violence. And what do I mean by that? So when it comes to grievance-driven violence, one, the attackers are smart. Two, they're patient. Three, they plan like crazy. Four, they'll do dry runs. And they're very dispassionate when they commit this act of violence. And most importantly, the act of violence is their end goal. It's what they're hoping to achieve. Now, if you look at the four source types of workplace violence, number one is community-driven. And yes, in theory, grievance-driven violence could be community-driven, but here's the problem with that. Community-driven violence is typically associated with someone from the community who enters the workplace to commit a crime and then engages in violence. Think about it, for example, as a robbery. You go into a bar to rob the bar and then they shoot a patron. Or you go into a convenience store. That's typically what they associate with community violence. Yes, it can also be a parking lot situation. And these days where that happens most often, let's say, is with robbery or encountering a mentally ill person, such as a homeless person, who becomes aggressive after coming there. But the difference is they're not planning the act of violence. They may be planning the crime, or the crime may be spontaneous, but the act of violence is not something that they've gone to great lengths to plan it. If you think about it, source type number two, which I like to call invitee violence, which is typically clients, customers, patients, maybe even vendors for your business, those types of workplace violence incidents also are not particularly planned out. They're not carried out as the end goal. It may be a result of lashing out. There isn't necessarily another crime that they're going to commit. It's more like lashing out. Maybe the person doesn't like the results that you achieved for them, or doesn't like being treated a certain way, or if it's a patient, maybe comes in and is having a psychotic breakdown. All of those types of things fall under invitee violence. Now, invitee violence it can be in and of itself a challenge to prevent, but it's not quite the same thing as grievance-driven violence. Number three of the source types of workplace violence is coworker or former coworker violence. And yes, if it's a former coworker, they might be angry, but those are not people that are plotting to do this in an in-depth way. They usually just go into the workplace. They're familiar with the workplace. They don't need to do any recon as a grievance-driven person might. They don't do test runs as a grievance-based person does when they go to commit their acts of violence. At most, they'll just show up. You know, we think about them from a shooting perspective, but any type of violence, whether it's fatal or non-fatal. But again, it's a different type thing. And then the fourth source type is violence committed by someone that is connected to an employee but doesn't work at your place of business. And those are usually private related. Oftentimes, those relate to domestic violence. And when you think about it, the abuser knows his ex's work schedule, knows the make and model of her car, knows where she parks, and can find her there when she comes out of work. but those are often driven either by anger or by money. If you think about source type of violence from the community, number one, that's typically money related, right? Robbery is typically money. Burglary is typically money. Number two is actually related to the type of service that they're getting, where they think they're getting some kind of problem with their service. Number three is inner office politics. It may be based upon feeling like someone was bullied and no one did what needed to be done. So this person felt they had no more choices but to react. And number four, when it comes to the domestic type stuff, that's personal, that's private life, but oftentimes it's related to money. It could be related to alcoholism, to other types of things. Could be the falling apart of a family situation or drugs. But those, again, are not long-term where they dwell upon these things. Those are more likely to act and be there because at this point they have opportunity, right? Those are opportunity-driven type things. Grievance-based violence is not opportunity-driven. It's planned, it's practiced, they do dry runs, they go ahead, they do reconnaissance, they work on locations, they can travel great distances. If you look at United Healthcare, if you look at the shooter in the incidents in Brown University and MIT, these people traveled a great distance. So there's much more that goes on to that. Going on to number two of the three most common workplace violence plan failures is not enough employee input and not really understanding how violence occurs and the types of violence that need to be addressed. So California requires that your workplace violence prevention plan be driven by the employees, by employee input, employee feedback, training requests, all of those types of things that come from the employee. And employers typically like to go top down. Thou shalt not commit sexual harassment. Thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt not do that. And for workplace violence prevention, your plan needs to go in the opposite direction. Now let's look at what a lot of employers think about when it comes to workplace violence. They think it's coworker related. They think it's former employees. But that's only 25% of workplace violence if you stick to the four source types. So employees have a much better sense of where their safety comes from. They also will know if they face a safety risk from outside of the workplace, from somebody they were currently connected to or formerly connected to. So you've got to actually start with them. You've also got to start with their input to understand the ways to make the corrections. When you interview an employee about the types of workplace violence hazards she faces, and she gives you a rundown and you ask her, what do you think we can do to make it safer for you, to take that safety hazard away from you? That's where it's very different. You can't look at let's say, the law for workplace violence and say, here's your safety hazards, here's what we're going to do, because it doesn't work that way. It must be specific to your employees, and that's why employee input is key. So if you are not starting and if you have not developed your workplace violence prevention plan based upon employee input, you need to go back to the drawing board, start again, and make it specific to the threats your employees face. Then you can come up with your approaches to address those, and then you can come up with the types of training that are necessary for them. Now, one of the reasons this is so critical is that in the real world, the vast majority of workplace violence is not active shooter. In fact, it's non-fatal workplace violence. And when it comes to that, the vast majority of incidents, it's almost 2-to-1, occur to female employees. They are at much greater risk of being physically attacked in a non-fatal assault. Now, one of the things that you have to look at is Wherein do you look at that? Because your male employees may face an entirely different workplace violence hazard than your female employees do. And again, if we're going to rectify these safety hazards to minimize the risk that your employees are going to be attacked or assaulted or injured, or in workplace violence phrasing, physically harmed, you've got to go ahead and start with the employees. Don't generalize your thought process on how to address safety hazards. They must be specific, and you've got to break down each one and say, okay, what can we do to make this better? And on number 3, the other biggest mistake or biggest problem with workplace violence prevention plans, particularly in California where this is mandated by the new workplace violence prevention law, is you've got to train your employees in strategies to avoid physical harm. But here's the problem. Unless you know enough about how violence occurs, you're really not going to know what works in order to prevent that physical harm. And violence occurs at different points, but often violence occurs without warning. So your employees have to have strategies not just to try to de-escalate, not to just try to avoid, but also to address these safety hazards when they arise, and when they arise without warning. Now, there's a lot of different things that can be done to do that, but you've got to rethink how you approach strategies to avoid physical harm, because the end goal is the avoid physical harm. It's not just to lessen the risk, it's to avoid. And now, going back to your employees, they're going to have some pretty good ideas, and California wants you to interview them. They want them to have input into the types of training they receive. But when you think about strategies to avoid physical harm, you need to think about different points. Okay, let's say your employees recognize there's a potential safety threat. Well, great, then situational awareness, which gives them the opportunity to recognize that there's a potential safety threat and avoid it, or at least be prepared to address it, is very important. Maybe your folks face situations where they can de-escalate. Maybe it's someone who is angry, but there's a chance they can work with them, help them calm down. Maybe you can bring in a coworker. There's safety in numbers. All of those types of things will work in a situation where de-escalation can work, but it doesn't work all the time. Like I said, a lot of times attacks just happen. You know, there's things like changing the dynamics of an attack. Your employees should know how to change a situation, how to take away an attacker's initial advantage when an attack actually happens. That's not easy to do, but it can be not only the difference between avoiding physical harm, it can be the difference between having to be hospitalized or treated at the ER. It can be the difference between missing a lot of work, or even worse, it can be the difference between life and death. So your employees need to be able to do that. And also self-defense, because when push comes to shove, if an attack occurs, you don't just want your employees taking it. They've got to be able to defend themselves or others. And by the way, California believes very strongly that self-defense and defense of others is appropriate for the workplace when it's necessary. Obviously, if it's not necessary, nobody wants to see that type of action. But if push comes to shove and it is necessary, California is perfectly fine with your employees doing that. Anyway, this is going to be a short one. I want to wish you happy holidays, and I'll see you in 2026. May this be a wonderful year for you. And as California finishes its revisions to the workplace violence prevention law, I'll keep you posted. Thanks again, and here's to a wonderful, successful, and healthy 2026.